This happened on New Year's Eve of 2021, back when I was 17. At the time, I was heavily into a now-deleted app called It's Me. If you don't know, It's Me was this platform where you could chat with people worldwide using animated avatars instead of showing your real face. It was a fun concept, and honestly, I met some great people there. But the app also had a darker side. Trolling, drama, and toxicity were pretty much part of the culture. One of the more chaotic features was the parties, basically live streams where a host could let 3 other people join them on screen while everyone else watched and commented in the chat. Like most people back then, I trolled these parties for fun. Usually, it was harmless, just joking around to get reactions. But one night, I trolled the wrong person. The host's name was Kaylani. She was well known on the app, though I had no clue who she was at the time. My username was Selenez, obviously not my real name. I joined her party and started making comments to mess with her. To my surprise, instead of ignoring me, Kaylani clapped back. We ended up going back and forth in the chat, and the party got packed with viewers hyping up the drama. After the party ended, I figured it was over. But then Kaylani messaged me directly on the app, and we continued arguing. At first it was funny, but things escalated quickly. She seemed genuinely angry, and I was too stubborn to back down. I was all talk, though, and eventually told her to pull up, just to see how far she'd take it. Kaylani didn't hesitate. She said she lived in Chicago, which was only about an hour and a half from me in Milwaukee. She was dead serious about meeting up, but I still thought it was all bluff. That is, until I asked for her address, and she sent it. Looking back, I can't believe how reckless I was. I grabbed my twin sister for backup and drove to her apartment complex. It was late, the area was sketchy, and my gut was telling me to turn around, but I ignored it. When we got there, I saw a girl standing outside, dressed in sneakers and a hoodie. She looked Hispanic and matched Kaylani's description, so I assumed it was her. I told my sister to wait in the car and walked up to Kaylani. Without much conversation, we started fighting. I grew up in the hood, so I knew how to defend myself, and honestly, I was holding my own. But then out of nowhere, a man grabbed me from behind. At first, I thought he was security or someone trying to break up the fight. But something felt off. He wasn't dressed like security. He reeked of alcohol, and his grip was way too aggressive. Before I could process what was happening, he was dragging me toward a beat-up black Honda parked nearby. Panic set in. I screamed for my sister, who jumped out of the car and ran toward us. Kaylani's friends came out of the building, trying to hold her back, while my sister grabbed a baseball bat we'd brought just in case. She managed to hit the guy once, but he shoved her away and shoved me into the trunk. I'll never forget the feeling of that trunk slamming shut. It was pitch black, cramped, and I could hear my sister screaming outside as the car sped off. I was completely terrified, clawing at the sides of the trunk and kicking as hard as I could. Thankfully, my sister was quick thinking. She called the police and started following the car. Meanwhile, I was texting her updates from inside the trunk, trying not to lose it. After about 5 minutes, the car stopped. The man opened the trunk and dragged me into an old run-down house. I fought him every step of the way, but he was strong. He locked the door behind us, and I was sure I wouldn't make it out alive. Just as he threw me into a back room, I heard sirens outside. Moments later, the door burst open and the police stormed in. They tackled the man to the ground, and to my surprise, he didn't even resist. He just sat there, calm as could be, while they cuffed him. When I reunited with my sister, I broke down. That night changed me forever. Life felt so fragile in that moment, and I realized how close I'd come to losing it all over something so stupid. Kailani disappeared from the app after that night. I deleted It's Me soon after and never told anyone on the platform what had happened. I moved on with my life, but the memory of that night still haunts me. If there's one lesson to take from this, it's to think twice before engaging with strangers online. What starts as a joke can escalate into something dangerous, and in my case, nearly deadly. Stay safe and have a happy new year. This happened on New Year's Eve, 2020, during the height of London's Tier 4 lockdown. For those who don't remember or weren't in the UK, Tier 4 was as strict as it gets. Stay at home unless absolutely necessary, no mixing with other households, and only essential trips outside for things like exercise or groceries. It was a bleak time, made worse by a new, highly transmissible strain of COVID-19 spreading rapidly. Hospitals were overwhelmed. The death toll was climbing, and the streets of London had an eerie, abandoned feeling. I'd spent 8 days straight cooped up in my small one-bedroom flat. Zoom calls and talking to myself could only go so far. By New Year's Eve, I'd hit my breaking point. At around 10 p.m., I decided to go for a quick walk to clear my head, technically allowed under Tier 4 rules. My plan was simple. A loop around the park on main roads, grab a bottle of red wine from the corner shop, and head back. When I stepped outside, mask in place, I was struck by how quiet it was. London is never silent, but that night felt different. The city was lifeless, the freezing air amplifying the stillness. I started walking, trying to shake the sense of unease creeping in. After a few minutes, I decided to cut through some side streets to save time. In hindsight, that was my first mistake. The side streets were even quieter than the main roads, and I quickened my pace. As I neared the park, I noticed a van, one of those large Mercedes Sprinters, turn into the street. It started heading in my direction. I slowed down, thinking it would pass, but as it got closer, it slowed too. My gut told me something wasn't right. Through the windshield, I could see 2 men in the cab, both between 25 and 40 years old. The van came to a stop, and the passenger side window rolled down. "Hey, friend," the passenger called out. "We are lost. Can you tell me how to get to X station?" His accent wasn't local, but that wasn't what set me off. It was the whole situation. A van driving around during a Tier 4 lockdown, looking for a train station? At this hour? Alarm bells were blaring in my head. I took a step back and quickly gave vague directions. The man frowned. "I didn't understand all that. Maybe you can show us?" Before I could respond, he opened his door. At the same time, the side door of the van slid open, and I saw 2 more men inside. Pure adrenaline kicked in. I turned and bolted, sprinting back down the side street I'd just come from. Behind me, I heard shouting. "Take the van around. I'll follow him." I knew I couldn't outrun them all the way back to my flat. They were younger, probably faster, and I'd already burned most of my energy in the initial sprint. My only hope was to use my head start and local knowledge to lose them. The side street led to a larger residential road lined with houses, each with tall hedges or fences. I spotted a house with an especially thick hedge and no lights on. Without hesitation, I ducked into the front garden and crouched behind the hedge, praying the occupants didn't have motion sensor lights. Seconds later, I heard footsteps pounding past. I held my breath as they slowed, then stopped. Peeking through the hedge, I saw the man who'd asked for directions standing a few houses down on the opposite side of the street. He was scanning the area, his breath visible in the cold air. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of an engine. My heart sank, thinking the van was coming back, but it was just a regular car. The man pulled out his phone, pretended to check something, and then walked off, leaving the residential street. I stayed hidden for another 10 minutes, my heart racing. I kept rehearsing what I'd say if someone in the house caught me. Maybe something about being chased or losing my keys. Thankfully, the house stayed dark. When I was sure the coast was clear, I slipped out of the garden and made my way home, sticking to shadows and jumping at every noise. I bolted my door the second I stepped inside and collapsed onto the couch, trying to process what had just happened. I debated calling the police, but what could I say? I hadn't been hurt or robbed. My gut told me those men had bad intentions, but gut feelings aren't evidence. And as a man reporting this on New Year's Eve, a notoriously busy night for the police, I doubted it would be a priority. I sat there sipping black coffee, shaking off the adrenaline, and realized how close I'd come to something truly terrible. All for some fresh air and a bottle of red. The next day, I stocked up on wine during daylight hours and vowed never to go for a nighttime walk again. If there's one thing to take from this story, it's to trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Stay safe out there. When I was around 12, I spent New Year's Eve at my friend's house while our parents went out for dinner in a nearby town. His house was old, isolated, and honestly, it scared the crap out of me. The only way to reach it was a long, overgrown track. A lot of my other friends at school claimed the house was haunted, and I even remember it being featured in a ghost book. We were sitting downstairs in the lounge, watching TV, when we heard the loudest crashing sound. I can still picture the look on my friend's face when we turned to each other in shock. We froze for a moment, unsure of what to do, but eventually we decided to investigate. We crept out of the lounge and down the hallway toward the rest of the house. The crashing sound had come from upstairs, so we made our way up. As we reached the top of the stairs, we felt a cold breeze, icy cold, like something was wrong. The house was massive, almost like a mansion built in the 1920s. We moved down the upstairs hallway toward the source of the wind and turned down another corridor. At the end was my friend's parents' bedroom, and the door was moving back and forth slowly. We both stopped dead in our tracks, frozen in place, staring at the door. After a long moment, my friend walked toward it. I stayed behind, paralyzed with fear. As he pushed the door open, he disappeared into the darkness of the room, and the silence was so complete I could barely hear anything. Then came the scream. It was the most blood-curdling scream I'd ever heard, and it sent my adrenaline into overdrive. I ran toward the room and scrambled for the light switch. When the light flickered on, I saw him standing there, frozen and pale, staring into an empty corner of the room. By his side, an antique mirror lay shattered across the floor in pieces. I placed my arm on his shoulder, trying to comfort him, and asked if he was okay. "He broke the mirror," he whispered. I asked who had broken it, and his reply chilled me to the bone. "The woman in the corner," she told me. I was terrified, and without saying anything else, I insisted we leave. As we turned to go, something made me stop. I wanted to check the mirror. Surely the wire had just snapped, or the whole thing had fallen down. I bent down to pick up the mirror and turned it over. The string that had held it to the wall was intact. The nail was still firmly fixed in place. At that moment, I was beyond scared. I grabbed him, told him to call his parents, and asked him to come back home. We waited outside the front door, shaking, until our parents returned from the restaurant. When my dad and his dad went upstairs to check the bedroom, they saw the broken mirror. They brushed it off as a game gone wrong and blamed us for making it all up. But after that night, my friend never mentioned it again. The worst part came years later when I was 24. I was talking with my mom about New Year's, and somehow that night came up. I told her the whole story, and she just said, "I believe you." Then she told me something that made my skin crawl. A few days after that night, my friend's mom had gone into her room and seen a woman there, telling her to leave the house. I froze. My body went cold, and all the memories from that night rushed back. Even though it was almost 12 years ago, it still sends chills down my spine. I'm a long-time reader, first-time poster, so I'm not sure if this is the right place to post, but it was so terrifying that I had to share it. I know some people say these stories are made up for immersion, but trust me, this one is 100% true. About a year ago, I was spending New Year's Eve with 3 of my friends, and we decided to camp out in a tent right near the woods. It seemed like a great idea at first, just a bunch of teens hanging out, having fun. We were laughing, joking, and doing the usual teenage things. Then we heard a rustling noise outside the tent. It didn't sound like a big animal, just something small, so we brushed it off as an animal moving through the leaves. As midnight approached, we had the flashlight on in the tent, blasting music, having a good time. That's when things got really strange. We heard it. This chirping noise. It wasn't a bird or a squirrel. It was an unearthly chirping that didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. It was sharp, almost mechanical, and it sent a chill down my spine. My heart raced, and I told my friends to turn off the lights and the music. They looked at me like I was crazy, but I was serious. "Turn it off, now," I demanded. Reluctantly they did, and we sat there in silence, listening. Then it came again, the chirping. It was distant at first, then grew louder. I could feel the tension in the air. We were all scared, but I was trying to stay calm. I had been taking karate for a few years, and I'm a pretty tall and strong girl, so I figured if anything came at us, I could protect my friends. They, on the other hand, were visibly freaked out, trying to convince themselves it was just some weird animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I suggested it could be something like a skinwalker or a flesh gate, creatures I'd read about that supposedly mock the voices of your loved ones, or make strange noises to lure you out. The idea was enough to make my friends even more terrified. Then we heard it again. But this time, it was much closer, right outside the tent. My heart was pounding in my chest. The chirping was unmistakable, and whatever it was big. I was sure it was close enough to see us, to know we were here. Panic set in, and my friends started asking me what I thought it could be. I wasn't sure, but I told them it could be something like what I had mentioned, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was hunting us. My friend's older brother had left us his knife earlier, and they all agreed I should be the one holding it. I wasn't thrilled about the responsibility, but I accepted it. I knew we needed to be ready for anything. We sat in the dark, too scared to move, the chirping now echoing through the woods. It wasn't long before we decided to go for a walk, hoping the noise would stop if we moved away from the tent. I liked the dark, the mystery of it all, but I could tell my friends were terrified. We didn't find anything out there, but the whole walk felt wrong, like we were being watched. By the time we got back to the tent, it was getting late. Early morning, actually. We fired up the music again, just trying to ignore what had happened. We set up a strobe light for fun, but in hindsight, that was probably the worst idea ever. We were just begging for something to happen. Then it came again. The chirp. That same terrifying sound. I grabbed the knife and unzipped the tent, ready to confront whatever was out there. I didn't see anything at first, but then I heard it. Something scurrying away, fast and heavy, retreating into the woods. I was certain it was something big, something intelligent. But my friends didn't hear it, so I didn't want to freak them out anymore. The night dragged on, and I stayed awake. I couldn't sleep, not with whatever that thing was circling our tent. I heard it again, closer this time, a howl mixed with the chirps. It was loud, disturbing, and it kept getting closer, then moving away like it was testing us, seeing if anyone would dare to leave the safety of the tent. I had my knife at the ready, slashing the air in practice, but I knew it wouldn't matter if it came down to a fight. We were alone out there. My friend's older brother had left, and there was no one to help us if something happened. I could hear the thing pacing around us, toying with us, making us feel vulnerable. I wanted to run out there, to find out what it was, but I knew that was exactly what it wanted. Finally, around 6 a.m., I felt like the thing had stopped. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it had finally moved on. I couldn't take it anymore, so I left a note for my friends, telling them I was going home. I didn't want them to think I was dead when they woke up. But honestly, I wasn't sure what I'd just survived. The walk home was just as terrifying. The streets were dark, poorly lit by flickering street lamps. My glasses were smudged, and I could barely see anything in front of me. But I kept my eyes peeled, scanning every shadow, knowing that thing was probably waiting for me to be alone. But I wasn't going to let it win. When I finally made it home, I crept inside as quietly as I could, trying not to wake anyone. My parents didn't hear me, thankfully, and I went straight to my room, exhausted and shaken. The next day, when I talked to my friends about it, they tried to convince themselves it was just fireworks or some kind of animal. But I could tell they were scared. They didn't want to admit what we all heard. I'll never forget that sound, though, and I can't help but feel like we were being hunted that night. Whatever it was, I don't think it was a coincidence, and I haven't spent another New Year's Eve outside since. If anyone asks, it was probably just an animal. But I know what I heard, and whatever it was, it's still out there. It was New Year's Eve, and my friends and I were at a remote cabin in the woods. We had rented it out for the weekend, thinking it would be a great way to escape the city and ring in the new year. No Wi-Fi, no distractions, just peace and quiet. But something didn't feel right from the moment we arrived. The cabin was old, rustic, just the kind of place you expect to find in horror movies. The wood creaked as we walked across the floors, and the dim lighting gave the whole place a chilling, unsettling vibe. We tried to push the feeling aside. It was just our nerves, right? We settled in, lit the fire, and started playing games while the countdown to midnight drew near. The first sign that something was off came when I heard a thud upstairs. I looked at my friends, and they seemed to have heard it too. But no one said anything. We all shrugged it off as the house settling, though deep down, I knew it wasn't. As the night went on, the noises got worse. At first, it was just faint knocks, barely noticeable over the music and laughter. But then, we all heard a loud bang coming from upstairs. It was followed by a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. We froze. I grabbed the flashlight from the bag and stood up. "Did anyone go upstairs?" I asked, my voice trembling. Everyone shook their heads. My friends were on edge now, exchanging nervous glances. "Maybe it's just the wind," one of them said, but I wasn't convinced. We could all hear it clearly now. Someone was upstairs, moving around. I turned off the music. Silence. Then came the whisper. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It sounded like a breathy rasp, almost like someone was trying to speak but couldn't. It was coming from above, from the second floor. I wasn't sure if I should call out, but I found myself stepping toward the staircase. Just then, the lights flickered. The entire cabin plunged into darkness. I heard my friend Sarah gasp. "Who turned off the lights?" I tried fumbling for my phone to use as a flashlight, but before I could, the door to the main room slammed shut with a deafening bang. Everyone screamed. I rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. "Who the hell did that?" Mark yelled, panic creeping into his voice. I tried the door again, more frantically this time. Nothing. It felt like we were trapped. "Don't open it," Sarah whispered, her face pale. "It could be one of us, but it might not be." We stood there listening as footsteps echoed above us, slow, deliberate steps pacing back and forth across the floor. Suddenly, we all heard something worse. A laugh. But it wasn't any of our voices. It was a low, guttural sound, like someone was laughing without joy, just pure malice. It sent chills down my spine. I glanced toward the kitchen, where I noticed the cabinet door was slightly open. I hadn't noticed it before. But there was something else. Something darker inside. A figure, a face, peeking from behind the door, watching us. I barely had time to process it before the figure lunged toward me. I screamed, stumbling backward. My friends rushed to the door, trying to pry it open, but it was stuck. We were trapped. The laughter got louder, and I could hear the heavy footsteps getting closer, faster now, as if whatever it was had begun running toward us. The walls shook with each step. Then, I felt it. Something cold, something icy, touched my shoulder. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. The air felt thick, suffocating. I heard the voice again, but this time, it was clearer. "You shouldn't have come here." I turned to my friends. "We need to get out." Now the door finally gave way. We pushed it open and bolted outside, but when I turned to look back at the cabin, I saw something I'll never forget. A shadow. Standing in the window, its face pressed up against the glass, the same twisted smile I had seen earlier. It wasn't just one of my friends, it was something else. We ran, not looking back. The next day, we called the authorities, but there was no sign of anyone in the cabin. No one had entered the property overnight, no signs of forced entry. But one thing we couldn't explain. In the guest book, someone had written in blood, "Happy New Year." It was New Year's Eve, and I was planning to spend the night alone in my new apartment. I had just moved into the building a few months ago, and I didn't know many people in the area. I wasn't in the mood for a party, so I ordered some takeout, cracked open a drink, and put on a movie. It was going to be a quiet night. Around 11:30 p.m., I heard a knock at my door. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was a neighbor with a question or someone delivering something. But then I realized I wasn't expecting anyone. I cautiously walked over to the door and peeked through the peephole. There was a man standing in the hallway. He was wearing a dark jacket, his hands stuffed in his pockets. I didn't recognize him. "Who's there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, sorry to bother you. I'm your neighbor from down the hall. My door's stuck, and I don't have a phone. Could I use yours to call maintenance?" His voice was calm, but something about it felt off. It sounded rehearsed. I didn't want to be rude, but I wasn't comfortable letting a stranger into my apartment. It was late, and something didn't sit right with me. "I'm sorry, but I don't think I can help you," I said, trying to sound polite. There was a long pause. The man didn't say anything. I stood there, wondering if I had made the right choice, when he finally spoke again. But this time, his tone was different. It was more insistent. "You sure?" "I don't want to cause any trouble. Just need to make a quick call, that's all." I could feel my heart racing. Why didn't he just go down to the lobby to use the building phone? Why was he so desperate to get into my apartment? "I can't help you," I said, my voice shaking a little. There was another long silence. Then, just as I was about to walk away, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was like fingernails scratching lightly against the door, almost like a nervous habit. I backed away from the door, my pulse quickening. "What the hell was that?" The man spoke again. This time, his voice was colder. "You're making a mistake," he said. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. My gut was screaming at me to stay away from the door, so I stepped back even farther, double-checking the locks. I wasn't sure what to do, but then I heard it. The sound of footsteps slowly walking away. I stood still, listening, waiting. My hand was still gripping the doorknob, but I didn't dare open it. After a few minutes, I heard the elevator doors open and close. Whoever he was gone. Relieved, I turned the lock and sat back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. I tried to put it out of my mind and distracted myself with the TV. But then, the door handle began to turn. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone walking back down the hallway, and I was sure I had locked it. The sound of the key turning was unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was trying to get in. The door creaked open slowly, just a few inches. I could barely see a silhouette on the other side, but I knew someone was standing there. I didn't move, barely even breathing. Then, in a whisper, the voice I had heard before spoke. "You locked it, but I still got in." Before I could even react, the door slammed shut. I stood there in shock, heart pounding. Whoever this was, they were no longer on the other side of the door. The apartment was dead silent. I couldn't stay there anymore. I grabbed my things, locked up, and left. I didn't even care about my belongings. I wasn't about to spend another minute in that apartment. The next morning, I called the building manager. I told him what happened, and he seemed confused. No one had reported a stuck door or any issues that night. But when I went to check the door, I noticed something strange. The lock had been tampered with, scratches around the keyhole, like someone had tried to pick it. The manager said there had been similar complaints recently, neighbors hearing strange sounds at their doors in the middle of the night. Some had even mentioned seeing shadows outside their doors, but nobody had been able to explain it. I never stayed in that apartment again. To this day, I don't know who that man was or how he got in, but every time I think about it, I hear the same voice in my head. You locked it, but I still got in. I went to visit my friend Juan at his house on New Year's Eve. We hadn't hung out in a while, so it was good to catch up. We both agreed to keep things low-key, just hanging out and talking. Juan had been a little distant lately, but I figured it was just stress from work and his personal life. When I arrived at his place, I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I checked my phone to see if he had sent me a message, but it was just a notification about a party he'd RSVP'd to on social media. Confused, I knocked again. After a couple more seconds, I heard footsteps from inside, and the door opened. Juan was standing there, looking a little disheveled. "You good?" I asked, noticing his slightly puffy eyes and the unshaved stubble on his face. "Yeah, just tired," he said, letting me in. He didn't smile, which was unusual for him. As we sat down, Juan told me he'd been dealing with some personal stuff, family issues, work problems, and the usual pressures of life. We spent some time talking about everything and catching up. But there was something off about him. He seemed a little too distracted, like he was barely keeping it together. "Do you ever think about that place?" Juan asked, his voice a little off. "The old building?" I thought it was strange that he brought it up, considering we hadn't been there in years. I shrugged it off, trying to lighten the mood. "Not really. I mean, it's just an old rundown place." But Juan wasn't letting it go. He looked at me with wide eyes, like he was focused on something else entirely. "You never feel like someone's still there? Like watching?" I froze for a moment, trying to figure out if he was joking or if he was actually serious. "Juan, what are you talking about?" I said, laughing nervously. "You've been watching too many horror movies." He didn't laugh. He just kept staring at me with that intense look. I changed the subject, but things didn't seem right. Juan wasn't responding like he normally would. It was like he was lost in thought, and I couldn't tell if he was talking to me or to someone in his head. I decided to leave, figuring it was time to call it a night. But as I stood up, I noticed something strange. The door to the room was half shut, even though I clearly remembered it being wide open when I came in. I pushed it open, thinking it was just the wind or a draft. But then I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There, in the mirror, I saw someone standing behind me. I turned around quickly, but the room was empty. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after the weird conversation with Juan, but I felt like something wasn't right. I decided to leave quickly. Juan didn't seem to notice my unease, still sitting on the couch, staring at his phone. I said goodbye, but he barely acknowledged me. I left his house and walked to my car, trying to shake off the feeling that something had been off. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror. I tried to convince myself it was just a reflection, that I had been tired, or maybe I had imagined it. But something about the way Juan had been acting, distant, unfocused, stuck with me. I didn't tell anyone about it. The next day, I texted Juan to check in, but he didn't respond. A few days passed, and I heard from a mutual friend that Juan had been struggling with depression and had started distancing himself from people. Looking back, I realized that night had been a sign. Juan had been dealing with something heavy, and I wasn't sure what happened in that room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just stress or tiredness. There was something deeper going on, and I didn't notice it until it was too late. It was New Year's Eve, and I had just moved to a new city. I didn't know anyone, so I figured I'd stay in, get some takeout, and watch the ball drop alone. It wasn't the ideal way to spend the night, but I didn't mind the quiet. Around 9 p.m., I decided to take a walk to get some fresh air. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional car passing by. I walked a few blocks, thinking about how different everything felt here. The buildings were taller, the streets wider, but the whole city felt empty. I was getting ready to head back when I saw something odd. Someone was standing at the corner near the park. They didn't seem to be doing anything, just standing still in the dark. I felt an odd chill run through me, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was someone waiting for a cab or just out for a late-night walk. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't moving at all. It was as if they were frozen in place. I felt my stomach tighten. Something about the situation didn't sit right with me. I crossed the street to avoid them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I quickened my pace, almost starting to jog, until I heard footsteps behind me. They were matching my pace. I spun around. There was no one. The street was empty, like it had been when I first walked through it. My heart started pounding in my chest. I was being paranoid, I told myself. It was just a quiet night, no reason to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still there. I decided to head back to my apartment, now more anxious than before. As I rounded the corner to my building, I noticed something strange. A man was standing under the streetlight across from the entrance. He wasn't looking at me, just staring at the ground. He was dressed in a dark jacket and jeans, blending into the shadows. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. It felt wrong, but I couldn't place why. I decided to walk past him quickly, trying to keep my distance. As I neared the door to my building, I heard footsteps again, this time coming from behind me. This time, I didn't turn around. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking, and finally unlocked the door. I hurried inside and slammed it shut. The silence inside was deafening. I locked the deadbolt, leaned against the door, and tried to steady my breathing. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I had been followed all the way home. I stood there for a few minutes, my heart racing, before I decided to take a quick look outside. Slowly, I approached the window and pulled back the curtain just a little. That's when I saw him. The man from the streetlight was standing across the street, staring directly at my window. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. My blood ran cold. I ducked away from the window, panicked. I couldn't stay there. I ran to the back door, planning to leave through the alley and find somewhere safe. But as I opened it, I froze. The same man was standing in the alley, just outside my door. I hadn't seen him walk over there. I hadn't heard him approach. I slammed the door shut and bolted all the locks. I immediately called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no trace of him. No one had seen anyone suspicious in the area. No one had heard anything. But I knew what I saw, and the fear I felt that night still haunts me. To this day, I can't walk that block again without glancing over my shoulder, wondering if he's still out there, waiting. It was New Year's Eve, and I was ready to ring in the new year with some friends at a local bar. The night was cold, but there was an excitement in the air. People were out, celebrating, and the city was alive with noise and lights. I had a few drinks, laughed with my friends, and felt like the night was going perfectly. But as midnight approached, I started feeling the urge to step outside for some fresh air. I left the bar around 11:45, walking alone down the dark sidewalk to get away from the crowded street. The place I was at was downtown, so even at night, there were plenty of people out. But by the time I walked a few blocks away, the crowds started to thin out. I turned down a quieter street, the sound of distant fireworks echoing in the air. The city felt oddly quiet, considering the holiday. I wasn't far from the bar when I noticed a man walking ahead of me. At first, I thought nothing of it. He was bundled up in a jacket, a scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. But as I got closer, I realized something wasn't right. He kept glancing back over his shoulder as if he was trying to make sure I was still following him. I felt a wave of unease, but figured I was just overthinking things. I stopped at a streetlight, hoping he'd pass me and continue on his way. But instead, he stopped too, standing still staring at me. My heart skipped a beat as I quickly checked around. No one else was on the street. He slowly started walking toward me, and for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to move. It wasn't that he was physically imposing, but something about the way he walked, it was slow, deliberate, and almost unnatural, made my stomach churn. As he got closer, I took a step back, instinctively looking for somewhere to duck into, but there was nothing nearby, just empty buildings and the faint sound of fireworks in the distance. He stopped just a few feet away from me and said, "You shouldn't be walking alone on nights like this." His voice was soft but unsettling, and I didn't know how to respond. I took another step back, this time turning to walk in the opposite direction, hoping he'd leave me alone. But then, he said something that made my blood run cold. "I know where you're going." I didn't dare turn around. I didn't want to see what his face looked like. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickened my pace, my steps now echoing on the empty street. I could hear him behind me, but I didn't dare look back. Every few seconds, I heard the soft patter of his footsteps, following me, just close enough to make me feel his presence. I turned a corner sharply, praying to lose him. I glanced behind me and saw him a few yards away, his figure faintly illuminated by the streetlights. He didn't run or chase after me. He just walked at a slow pace, keeping his distance, but always following. Finally, I reached the main street, where the crowds were thicker. I pushed through the people, keeping my eyes on the road ahead, my breath short and shaky. I didn't stop until I got back to the bar, where I quickly went inside and locked the door behind me. I took a moment to catch my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My friends didn't notice my unease when I returned, and I didn't want to spoil their night by telling them. But when midnight struck and everyone cheered, I couldn't stop thinking about the man. I'd left the bar thinking I wanted a quiet moment to myself, but I couldn't have known that I was walking straight into something that would haunt me for a long time. I was spending New Year's Eve at my friend's house. The party was in full swing, people laughing, music blasting, and drinks flowing. It was the perfect celebration, the kind you expect when you're about to ring in the new year with all your friends. Around midnight, we crowded in front of the TV for the countdown. The whole house erupted in cheers as the fireworks went off outside. Everyone was in high spirits, but then I noticed something strange. My friend, Mark, was acting a little off. He was staring at his phone, frowning. I asked him if everything was okay, but he just brushed it off and told me it was nothing. He got up and stepped outside for a few minutes to get some fresh air. It was weird, because Mark wasn't the type to just leave like that in the middle of a celebration. but I thought maybe he just needed a breather. After about 15 minutes, I started getting antsy. The music was getting louder, everyone was having fun, but Mark still hadn't come back. I decided to check on him. I grabbed my coat and walked outside, calling his name. The cold air hit me immediately, and the street was dead quiet. I walked up and down the driveway, trying to look for him. No sign of him anywhere. I called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. That's when I started to feel uneasy. Something felt off. The whole street was dark, no cars, no people. I walked further down the block, checking around corners. Still nothing. Then I saw a car parked a few houses down. It was an old sedan parked in an odd spot, right at the edge of the street where no one ever parks. It was running, the headlights dim, as if someone had just parked it and left it there. I didn't think much of it at first, but then the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I noticed the engine was still warm. My stomach twisted. I felt like someone was watching me. I started walking back toward the house, hoping Mark would just walk around the corner and laugh at me for worrying. Suddenly my phone rang. I checked the screen. Unknown number. I answered it, thinking it might be Mark, but all I heard was heavy breathing. My heart started racing. The breathing wasn't quick, it was slow, like they were waiting for me to say something. "Hello?" I said, trying to stay calm. Then, a voice, soft but clear. "You shouldn't have gone outside." I froze. The voice was unmistakably male, but I couldn't place it. I felt like I was being watched. The line went dead, and my phone immediately cut out. The call ended. I tried to call Mark back, but the call wouldn't go through. I panicked. I ran back toward the front door, but it was locked. I banged on the door, shouting for someone to let me in. My hands were shaking, and my breath was coming in short bursts. My friend Sarah opened the door, looking at me like I was crazy. "Where's Mark?" I asked, my voice shaky. "I don't know. He hasn't come back in," she said, confused. "You didn't see him?" I didn't even wait for an answer. We searched the house, checked the yard, but there was no sign of him. I noticed his phone was lying on the front porch, cracked screen facing up. My stomach dropped. I picked it up, calling his number, but it was dead. That's when we called the police. They arrived, and within an hour, they started scouring the area. They searched the woods behind the house, where we usually went to hang out. It was there, near the tree line, that they found Mark. He wasn't injured, but he was dead. No signs of a struggle. No one knew how he'd ended up in the woods or what had happened to him. His body was just there. The police questioned me about everything. When I told them about the car I'd seen earlier and the phone call I received, they said it could have been a prank. But deep down, I knew something more sinister was at play. Then, they checked his phone. There was one last message, unread. It was from an unknown number. The message simply said, "You shouldn't have gone outside." After everything settled, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me that night, that someone knew what I was doing every second. Who made that call? Why did they say that? And why did Mark go outside in the first place? Every New Year's Eve since, I get this feeling in my gut like I'm being watched. And every time I hear a knock at the door or a strange number on my phone, I can't help but remember that night. The night I stepped outside and heard a voice telling me I shouldn't have. It was New Year's Eve, and I was home alone. My parents were at a party, and my older brother was spending the night at a friend's house. I didn't mind the quiet. I had my dog Max and a night of Netflix planned. The evening started uneventfully. Max lay sprawled on the rug as I got lost in a true crime documentary. The house was silent except for the TV, but halfway through the second episode, Max suddenly tensed. His growl started low and deep, vibrating through the living room. He was at the front door, his ears perked and tail stiff. His whole body seemed to radiate unease. "Max, what is it, boy?" I asked, setting my popcorn down. I walked over and peered through the peephole, but no one was there. The porch light barely illuminated the driveway, and the street beyond was empty. Just darkness and the faint hum of distant fireworks. "Probably just the wind," I mumbled, patting Max's head. But as I turned back to the couch, I made sure to lock the deadbolt. 30 minutes passed, and I'd nearly forgotten about Max's outburst until I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was deliberate, slow, and heavy. It sent a jolt of fear down my spine. Max sprang back to the door, barking furiously this time. I froze, staring at the door. My hands were clammy, my heart thudding against my ribs. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice wavered, betraying my nerves. No response. The silence was worse than the knock. I walked closer to the door, unsure if I wanted to open it. Then my phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the tension. I grabbed it, expecting a message from my parents. Instead, it was from an unknown number. "Happy New Year." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't respond. Moments later, another text came through. "You didn't answer the door. That's rude." I dropped the phone. My stomach churned with dread. Someone knew I was here. Alone. I quickly checked my phone for service. No signal. Of course, tonight of all nights. Then Max began to whimper. His growls faded, replaced by small, frightened whines. He backed away from the door and stared at the staircase. His eyes were wide, his tail tucked between his legs. "Max?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Then I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps from upstairs. My blood turned to ice. I hadn't gone upstairs all night. No one else was supposed to be here. I grabbed the fireplace poker from the hearth and crept toward the stairs. My heart pounded in my ears as I climbed each step, the wood creaking under my weight. At the top, I froze. My parents' bedroom door was ajar, and I could see the faint outline of someone standing inside. They were tall, their figure illuminated by the pale glow of moonlight spilling through the window. "Get out!" I shouted, raising the poker like I knew how to use it. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, unnaturally still. Then it tilted its head almost curiously, like it was studying me. My breath hitched as I noticed something glinting in their hand. A knife. I didn't wait to see what they'd do next. I turned and bolted down the stairs, Max at my heels. I didn't even bother grabbing my shoes. I flung the front door open and ran straight to my neighbor's house. Pounding on their door, I screamed until they answered. I was out of breath, barely able to explain what had happened. They let me in and called the police. The officers arrived within minutes, but when they searched the house, they didn't find anyone. The back door was unlocked, and muddy footprints led from the staircase to the backyard patio. They asked if I knew anyone who might want to scare me, but I shook my head. I didn't have enemies, at least none that I knew of. As they continued searching, one of the officers called me into the kitchen. There, on the counter, was a note I hadn't left. It read, "Happy New Year." The handwriting was neat, almost cheerful. To this day, I don't know who it was or how they got in. But every New Year's Eve since then, at the stroke of midnight, I swear I hear it again. Knock, knock, knock.